Welcome to Controversy and Conversation tonight, where we're discussing the film Above All Else with our guest, Mark K. Tilsen. Thank you for being here tonight. Mark's joining us from Rapid City, South Dakota. He's an Oglala Lakota poet and educator, and also activist. He was present at Standing Rock and also, and I know I'm going to butcher this because I don't speak French, La Eau de Vie camp in Louisiana, where he's been active against pipelines. And he's also going to share, so this evening he's going to share with us some of his thoughts about the film and activism around pipelines in general. And also his own experiences. And he's also going to share some of the poems that he wrote based on his experience at Standing Rock. So I'm really happy to have him here tonight. I feel quite honored. We are going to record this so that we can share tonight's presentation with folks who couldn't be here this evening. And thank you for being here tonight. Now, our director, Polly Strong, is going to show a clip from the film, and then we'll get the conversation started.
This is about a 2-minute clip of the film.
This is our homestead. This is all that we have to leave our daughter.
What we will be doing on David's property, it's literally our last chance to stop the pipeline. They will be laying the pipe in the ground. So an escalation of tactics is needed.
This whole project is about transporting Alberta tar sands. It's the dirtiest, most expensive, unconventional fossil fuel in the world.
I don't want to be a coward.
You're not a coward.
But we're nothing but a bug under their shoe.
There are people locked to your truck. Turn it off.
If there's a fight you believe in, it's worth getting engaged in it, even if you get your teeth kicked in, because you went out and you played it.
Here's what's at stake for me now. I have my family, which I'm fixing to lose, or this.
It's cutting trees that are probably like 20 feet from me. Over.
Defend yourself against something that's far larger than you and everybody else. It's pretty daunting.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Mark now to get the conversation started.
Hello, Wachopa Luta Machapalo Oglala Lakota Mie Pchahe Sinte Awati. I'm a poet and educator from Porcupine, South Dakota, and I'm just honored to be here. I'm coming from you from Rapid City, South Dakota, which is part of the Black Hills, part of our traditional treaty territory, has Lakota people. And watching the movie was really interesting. I saw a lot of moments that kind of like brought up some very traumatic things for me, particularly like when the helicopters start showing back up. And at Standing Rock, and to a lesser extent at Oglala Vie, which was a resistance camp in Louisiana fighting against the Bayou Bridge pipeline, which was the tail end of the Dakota Access Pipeline, or a whole series of pipes that started in the back and oil fields of North Dakota and went all the way down to the terminus at St. James. Same kind of pipeline that it's actually a lie that both the Alberta tar sands or the Bakken have anything to do with domestic production of oil. They're actually designed to export to China, primarily India and also Pakistan. Those are like, it's one of the like, it's one of the biggest lies that both TransCanada and all of the other pipeline companies engage in, is that somehow this is made for American domestic use. So therefore it has something to do with homeland security, national security, or energy security. And it just doesn't. It has to do with profits, entirely about have to do with profits, and to extracting as much resources and money out of both the Bakken oil field, the Permian, where y'all are from, and the tar sands as possible before we can fundamentally stop them. And they've used that language and weaponized it very particularly with a series of legislation starting in South Dakota, later Louisiana, Texas, and then back up to Minnesota, what they called critical infrastructure bills, meaning protesting something of critical infrastructure, which these pipelines are now dubiously located, are called, escalates what would be a misdemeanor trespassing offense, or what was it, DC disorderly conduct charge, escalates it to a felony level that will stay on your permanent record and can be punishable by a $10,000 fine or 10 to 15 years in prison. Which is like the kind of charges people get for doing a drive-by, you know what I mean? And it's for doing the exact same kind of actions that you saw in the movie, like literally taking what they call a lockbox, which is the piece of equipment, and then securing yourself to the semi, which was carrying the pipe. It was really good to see some old familiar faces, both from Loe La Vie and from Standing Rock. On the moment when they were doing the DC action, I saw my friend Gitz Deranger. I think Tom Goldtooth was there. My aunt Deb Whiteplume, Thomas Mueller, like some just some native activists that I've known for years. And it was really cool to see some familiar faces. And they had a really interesting arc and trajectory. And they started off as this, it's actually incredibly well edited on the pacing, because it shows you like, everyone loves when like a local fight becomes a regional fight and then blooms up to this larger national dialogue. But then when the nitty gritty, like the shit is hitting the fan, and you're now in the position where it's no longer about policy litigation, you're down to a handful of roughnecks who are dropping pipe, bunch of mercenaries and security guards, and whatever wild ass frontliners you can actually get to show up and throw down with you. It's a very different prospect. And there's a lot of organizations and a lot of people who are not comfortable with that. And you saw through the course of the film itself is like the folks who did not want this pipeline to be built, but I think they come from a different background than a lot of the indigenous activists, like fighting against the pipelines. And it's not just fighting against the pipeline. Some of it is an entire critique of both Western civilization, extractive industry, and capitalism, particularly global capitalism. Like some folks come to fight that battle out on the front lines, and that is their ideological heart and core. Whereas a lot of the local folks, they're fighting for their property value, they're fighting for their property rights, they're fighting for their retirement, and they're fighting for the land where they immediately there are. I think, Standing Rock was way different than that. Like most, we didn't own that property. That was our treaty territory, and that has been stolen from us for over 140 years. And like the fight wasn't because even that level, like a bunch of us who are Lakota and a lot of people who consider themselves to be politicized, don't actually care about treaty rights. Like it's a legalistic argument, not an inherent right or belief. Like I think a lot of us, and I'm speaking in general terms, and we're not a monolith and everyone has different opinions, so I apologize. But a lot of Lakota people, we have more belief in our ancestors, in our natural law, and our history has coming from a very spiritual tribe, but also a warrior tribe. That we're coming up to fight, not for ourselves as individuals, but for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and for the water itself. Like at Standing Rock, mini kiwichoni or mini wichoni, like water is life in the most literal of all possible sense. Like on Pine Ridge, where I'm from, we have a water pipeline going from the Missouri, and that's called Mini Wichoni, which is one of the largest freshwater projects in America. And so our families drink the water that would be affected by that pipeline. And that's why we showed up by the hundreds and the thousands at Standing Rock. Going back to like the editing and pace and flow of the campaign, fighting a pipeline has a beginning, middle, and an end. And sometimes they fizzle and sometimes they end really dramatically. I think Standing Rock ended very dramatically and had like three moments of its like three big peaks. And that was October 27th when was established a treaty camp that was raided by the police, and was basically we lost the momentum and the tempo of the fight against the construction of the pipeline during October of that year. The other time was when Barack Obama canceled the Army Corps of Engineers permit to drill under the river. But they also didn't bring people who would come in and enforce that lack of drilling. So Barack Obama always intended for that pipeline to be built, even then when it looked like we were winning in court or we won that day. And that was effectively the end of kind of any real hope of fighting the pipeline in any meaningful way. Because not only did we lose the momentum and tempo, we now even lost the base argument. Like, oh, it's not approved. You don't have to worry about it. The president has shut down this pipeline. And it created a false sense of victory that really cut us off at the knees. The last one would be when it was actually raided by a series of South Dakota sheriffs and the National Guard, which was, I believe, February 28th of 2017. I think, yeah. And so these moments, these really big moments, like in the film, I think it's Daniel who's like, there's that moment where Daniel is looking at losing his family and his land and his freedom. And in the like staring down the barrel of that says, I'm going to ask you all to go. That's tough. It's also one of the reasons why like these pipeline fights, like what land you are situating yourself on is incredibly important. So tactically, that doesn't happen. There was a pipeline fight in northern Minnesota around line 3, and this was when they were doing a tiny piece of the construction. And there was a resistance camp, and it was on a land that was owned by a white man. And when there was enough contention and stress between the campers and the landowner, he decided to shut down the camp and kick everyone off. And this was like people were winterizing a camp and looking towards a long-term fight from this particular location. So like picking your spot where you make your stand is incredibly important, because otherwise you end up in a situation where you invest weeks and months of your life to make a stand, and it you kind of have like, it's not even that you have the victory taken from you, it's like the fight is taken from you, and that is really, really difficult. Yeah, I thought like just in terms of like filmmaking, what you'd see now is you'd see something that would look a little bit glossier. Like we all have like GoPros, and the new ones, like the 8s and 9s, they're just silk on glass. Like they have digital stabilization and 3 different points of access, and they can shoot in 4K. And the 4K cameras are getting way cheaper and more handheld. And 4K drones are really common now. And 4K drones are a pretty big game changer, both at Standing Rock and the La Vie, for visual storytelling. And instead of it just thinking like, oh, we're having the high ground, you're like, we can, instead of having to drive all the way out all over the land, you can have somebody park, be really discreet, send out a drone, and scout out where the new pump sites are, where are they doing this operation. And I think tactically, like, it's one of the things that we saw like at Standing Rock to great effect, is we didn't fight at 1 or 2 points of constant contention. Wherever the pipeline was, that was the front line. And the front line is almost like this, it's a shifting place. And one of the things is, as a water protector, you get to decide where your front line is, because your enemy's everywhere and they're vast. And in a lot of ways, they have a much more difficult time defending themselves than you have a time going at them. It's only when you limit your choices and strategy and tactics that you kind of are fighting on their terms. Like what we saw in the film is there was somebody who made some vague threatening language, and then they thought that violated the terms of their understanding of nonviolent direct action. And there's a lot of people, like, I don't even really use the term NVDA much anymore. Like, just, we can say direct action and the nonviolence. If that's your jam, that's what you're about, that's okay. And it's at the point, like, where the conversation between violence versus nonviolence, after the uprising, after the continuous police brutality, after the continuous rampant chaos that's being unleashed by these corporations and this corporate state, I don't think having the conversation is particularly even helpful anymore. And as you can see right there, somebody made some vague threatening remarks and they were labeled a terrorist in the media. There's a pipeline resistor named Jessica Resnick, who's facing 8 years in prison for cutting holes in pipelines. And she was hit with this label of being an eco-terrorist. And under the Biden administration, having that label of terrorist gives you what they call enhanced charges. So basically doubled her time in prison because of this arbitrary decided label. And there is no amount of resistance that is effective that will ever be appreciated or understood or accepted by your enemy. That just doesn't exist. That only appreciates your peacefulness and your prayerfulness if you're ineffective. But if you actually, like at Standing Rock, there's people who did ceremonies out on the land that shut down construction. And then we found from leaked documents from Tiger Swan, they called us jihadi eco-terrorists. Yeah. And one of the things that's interesting about that is these guys were global war on terror fighters. And they were private mercenaries. A lot of them were special forces. The founder was a Delta guy, and Delta is like a very elite counter-terrorist unit within the United States Army. Like for decades, it wasn't even ever officially confirmed the two exist. So you have these like tier one operators who know how to brand themselves using their GWAT, their global war on terror terms, and then targeting people who are fighting pipelines with them. So they can get paid to run security and also run intelligence and counterintelligence ops within the resistance camps. And I think that type of like sophistication didn't quite exist at the tar sands blockade. I think you were probably getting your regular like green scare kind of lefty greeny infiltration. But at every single one of these camps, we assume that there are paid infiltrators and spies. And no matter how thorough our vetting process, unless we become an incredibly tiny exclusive club, we kind of operate with a certain level of knowledge that there are people among us who mean us harm. And yeah.
Well, it sounds like from what you're saying, and this is, are there still active, active pipeline resistance? Is that just something that's ongoing and we just don't really hear about it in the mainstream, from mainstream media sources? Just that's.
Well, everywhere there is a pipeline, it is being contested. And sometimes it depends. Again, it's also where is that pipeline at on the timeline?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because like, remember, this whole started with like public utility commissions, levels of conversations. It started with back and forth with the lawyers. And then they started doing what they call pre-construction. Like what's funny is that whole devastation of doing those clear cuts, legally, that's not even considered construction of the pipeline. So, this is, oh my God, how do I say this? The way that the Army Corps of Engineers and the way that the land use permits are created, it encourages illegal behavior. Because the more pre-construction that they do, it actually looks like the pipeline is going to be successful. And that is a requirement for getting the further permits. But yeah, going back to your point, yeah, there's always going to be whatever there is a pipeline fight, it is being contested. And sometimes it's done through one of the largest resistance that we've seen in years in Canada was a pipeline fight, CGL, which the Unistoten and Wet'suwet'en have been fighting for over 10 years. And they had blockades from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia to the port of Vancouver. They had 75% of their rail system shut down due to Indigenous resistance. And the pending possible having another Oka crisis with the Mohawk because they decided to throw down. Yeah, and the global story that washed that away was COVID. And what's interesting is like, and terrifying, they had a near complete shutdown, like a 75% shutdown of their rail system. And then they had a 95% shutdown of the rail system. And the system in Canada, capitalism, was strong enough to bounce back from it. So it's almost like whenever like like there's this weird like magician type market force that's happening in the background among all this. Like if the price of oil dropped by 50% and was down to past like $30 or $40 a barrel, most of these, even the concept of doing these pipelines and extractive projects, they would evaporate. Like I think we were at 55 a barrel when we were fighting them at Standing Rock. And what that meant is all the wildcatters stopped. And wildcatters are people who are dropping untested wells. So there's this weird economic thing that's going on. Like right now, lithium mining in Australia lost 20% of its value in the past 10 days. In South Dakota, the two Canadian companies that are mining here lost 7.5% and then 15% of their stock value based off of market readjustment. So the viability of these projects actually needs this like fantastical thinking to operate.
And in some ways, that's what happened. So I knew that the Keystone Pipeline had been canceled, but I wasn't exactly sure why. And so it seems like that part of what happened when the Keystone project was canceled formally by TransCanada in 2021 was that it wasn't economically viable anymore. The price of oil had fallen to such a degree that it wasn't going to be economically feasible for them anymore. Is that?
Well, not exactly, because up until 3 weeks before they canceled the project, they were still telling their investors about the long-term viability of the project.
Interesting.
Biden actually canceled the Canadian border crossing, and kind of stamped it dead. And even though that it was finally canceled, it took them a long time to realize, well, this is actually real now. And they felt like in good conscience, they couldn't string along their investors anymore. And meanwhile, like there's a lot of people who've been fighting that KXL pipeline for a lot of time over a lot of spaces. And people took arrests, people took some damage. Yeah. Like, I think that was one of the things that was kind of weird, like not weird, but like how like we saw like one AR-15 like at all. And at Standing Rock, like all of the police were still wearing like their Smokey and the Bear hats back in August. And by the time October round around, it was like flak jackets and M4s. And it was just an entirely different thing. Like seeing the militarized police, it was like, they look like the military. Yeah. Not really any two ways about it. And I think at Oglala V, it was a lot more like the tar sands in a lot of ways, because it was way smaller, way more intimate. Like our entire camp at Oglala V would have been like one camp at Standing Rock, and Standing Rock had, depending on the day, I think between 500 and 4,000 people at the camp. And at its peak, I think it had between 12 and 16,000 at one time. And that was like, it was impossible to move or do anything. We had so many people, it was impossible to physically move. Yeah. But like even at Standing Rock, there came a time where, you know, Dave Archambault, the tribal president, told everyone to go home. And for water protectors, it was like, I gave up my house to be here, dude. I don't have anything to go back to. And I lost my teaching license when I was up there. In the state of South Dakota, you can't renew your teaching license if you have a felony charge over your head. And because I was already a teacher for 2 years, I missed the extended filing date because I still had charges while that elapsed. And I had a house I was gonna build. And like I had a decent life back home before Standing Rock. And you know, I think there's like a lot of people who, like, one of my cousins basically had her mom raise her kids for 4.5 months while she was fighting the pipeline. And that is a really big sacrifice. Yeah. And I think that like there's also the mythology and the reality of the paid protester. In Louisiana, it was really interesting because they all thought we were paid protesters down there, because that actually happens. There was a organization that was trying to get a gas like a gas electric plant built in New Orleans. So they hired a bunch of actors at $18 an hour to fill up the Public Utility Commission's public meetings, and had the same literature memorized, were wearing the same shirts, got up and gave testimony with their addresses, and then they collected their checks. So the idea got in people's heads is like, oh, all this resistance stuff is just a hustle. It's a paid protester. But there are a handful of NGOs that they make a living doing this kind of thing. And most of those folks are like policy wonks. They do public awareness campaigns. Public awareness campaigns. And it's rare that you'll actually see them on the front lines, like a Standing Rock or a tar sands blockade. Yeah.
I feel like I'm asking
So
all the questions. Somebody.
So you're talking about the people behind the lines. Have there been any successes in ground level legal challenges or anything? Or does that ever work? Does that ever work? Has that ever, have you ever got substantial results with legal challenges aside from on the President Biden level?
West Virginia, but they don't exist in a vacuum. Like West Virginia had a tree sit that lasted almost 2 years. And on the Virginia side, there was continuous resistance. And one of the things I was in, like those guys, like those folks, I should say, were being very creative with their type of like physical materials and blockades. Like there was an old teacher who wanted to do a blockade, but she wanted to do it in a car that came out the same year she graduated. So they got an AMC Gremlin, and they turned it into a giant cement-filled lockbox. Yeah. And it's just like when it comes to that, that's kind of like the fun stuff, where you can just like, how weird are we going to make it? How safe can we make it? Because that was like a tank. So they were being super safe. Whereas like doing a run and gun, so just like lock down to the semi, that's scary, dangerous. And you're really, really counting on your worker liaison to have that conversation, to be absolutely forceful, and to put their own body in the way of the vehicle. So not only are they going to run somebody over that they can't see behind them on their 18th wheel, they're going to have to physically push into somebody who's right up on their bumper. And that's way more difficult. Somebody that's staring in the eyes. But so there's like, even though that, we're all at the front line, and depending on where we're at in the pace of the campaign, the timeline, there are ways of being relatively safe in doing this. And there's ways of like, you didn't even bring blocks to block the tires, or you didn't even make sure the guy knew you were there. And there's ways that like people can get hurt. And even when we do it the best possible way with really experienced people, I know folks have permanent nerve damage in their wrists, their fingers, and their hands because of how that they chose to lock down and the type of extraction that was done to them. Some of that's within your control, but at some point when you're kind of all in, you're a little bit at the mercy of others. And I'm a real big guy, so I never wanted to climb up no trees. I was never gonna be me. Being in Louisiana was interesting because we were marching through a cane field, and I've never walked through swampy gumbo like that before. And so when I was walking, I was buried up past my knees in mud and like just barely slogging along. And it made me actually reevaluate like how I was like, this is actually physically different territory than where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to change how I move my body through this space. And it's like you have to, like, especially when you're living out on the land, you have to respect it. And you have to learn from it and let it teach you. And because if you can, like, the land will become your friend and you'll start having a relationship with it. And most of the cops did it. Like Louisiana cops, they move from air conditioning to air conditioning. That's how they survive. So if they're hanging out and trying to bust a bunch of swamp rat water protectors who are used to living out 90 degrees with 100% humidity, they're going to get upset, they're going to get cranky, and they're going to have a hard time being effective.
Well, I'd love to hear some of the poetry that you.
Oh, I think Paula has a question.
Okay, and then we can go to poetry.
I was just curious because the encampment and the tree climbers and all those kinds of things were obviously very frontline, very action oriented kinds of things. I've heard of trainings that try to help people look at it, a broader support network behind all that activity. So legal support, especially when you get hauled away, but also for contesting any subpoenas or other legal actions that are being brought against the people there. And also levels of just supporting the community in terms of food, water, other needs that go on during those kinds of protests. Do you have some good examples where those things really became essential, or was everybody learning during the Standing Rock period?
Standing Rock was interesting because like there's a lot of folks who came in and this wasn't their first rodeo.
Yeah.
So like there was a medic council that was established very quickly, and there was a lot of herbal medicine. Getting people to trust the herbal medicine outside of like sage tea and bear root and bitter root and what we're used to was actually difficult. There was people who'd get sick, like infamously we had this thing called the dapple cough, and some of it was from pepper spray, tear gas. Someone theorized that we were airdropped with Rosal, never been documented. But mostly it was like living in really intense smoky areas in a lowland area that didn't ventilate well. And then people who were getting so frustrated and getting sick and not treating their breathing illnesses. But there's for a time, other than the dentist, you had better medical care and better access inside the Ocheti Shakoi camp than you did over at the Indian Health Service down the road. And I think that's one of the things that we learned a lot and had to relearn. Childcare is really, really important. Really, really important. Having just even what we call street medics, like experienced folks who've been around and can administer enough first aid to stabilize someone to get them to an emergency room. And having those folks is also a confidence boost. Yeah, when it comes to like legal support, we would kind of use jail support and legal support differently. Legal support would be like your next court case, whereas jail support is like, what do you need? How hard? Like, if do you have your medication? Do I need to go advocate hard for you to get your medication? Like what? Like, or do I just need to get you like your favorite cigar when you get out, and like get you a nice China, like we're gonna get some Chinese food, whatever you want, and get you living off, like get you in a hotel for a night, so you're not living on a tree sit or living on the ground immediately after you get out of jail. And trying to create community and ceremony around like, by the way, yeah, well, you might have only gone in for a couple of hours or a couple of days, but still being inside those jail systems suck. And it's still harmful to interact with the violence of the police state in that particular way. And it's dehumanizing. Like, you know, some of the folks are walking around with a lot of trauma, and a lot of like, I met folks who've been arrested many times, and they're incredibly claustrophobic. So it's not like this is easy for them. It's actually incredibly difficult, and it's striking, and it's re-stimulating and triggering for them. And they do it anyways because they believe in the larger cause. Sorry, I kind of got on a rant, but yeah, systems. Like one of the real savvy things that people are talking about now is mutual aid and mutual aid networks, like creating a culture of care. And some of our real folks who put a lot of time and interest is like, we need to figure out how to be safe with one another so we can do dangerous things. And what that is about is like, you know, like if you cut out alcohol, you lose like 90% of your problems go away. If you have a camp that's alcohol free, most of your troubles are going to be different, very, very different. They're not going to be less. They're just going to be different. And creating that culture of care is like, how do we not replicate the same systems of patriarchy, white supremacy, and violence that we're actually fighting against? So how we fight should be important as what we're fighting. And I think this was the point where I'm still like having like a conversation in my head about it. I don't think it was necessarily that this one person went and decided to threaten one of the workers, but to the point that he violated the trust he had with his friends and comrades. That was probably, when we're thinking about culture of care, that's probably the biggest misstep rather than the tactic or whatever. Yeah. Would you like to hear some poetry?
Would like to hear some
Absolutely.
poetry. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes, so that's a good way to close.
All right, let's see. I have to find some. My book's really sad. Like, it's a tearjerker. I'm sorry. I think I have one about Oglala Lakota that's really nice. Nostalgic for the now. It's something in the way the light catches the warm rain falling in the French Quarter, tiny lightning bugs in the bayou signaling the endless squadron of sunset dragonflies, the smell of chicory, coffee, and strange spices, tobacco, deet, sage, citronella, and something sweet. Shared struggle, same goal. This must be a fashionable occasion. It's brought the finest people. Even in gathering, we're still missing friends not here, wishing they'd be the next headlights pulling into camp. We fantasize about books and having the time to read them. We hide out in the thunder with no place to hide from it, with puppies biting our toes, the right song on the speaker, deep laughs from stress that fall onto us unexpectedly like quick swamp storms. I stood here in this time and place. No one can say I didn't. These are the good times and they are not easy. We fight until we can't and we keep going. And this is probably one of my more, I read this one a lot. I always struggle with the labels. I don't like being called an activist. People would call me like a veteran from Standing Rock, like I fought in a war. And I mean, I do get I'm a little PTSD'd out from it still after all these years, but like I've had other way more dramatic things happen to me since then. So labels are tough. Water protector is a big one, which is what this poem's about. The one that I kind of like and kind of agree with, but I can only own up to it like a couple of months out of the year is Frontliner. And that one's pretty cool. But water protector. It is best said in a Boston accent, water protector. It is not aesthetically pleasing, a trite label, a shortcut to thinking. Some government workers adopted it, thought they meant they weren't protesting, and so they could keep their jobs. Some wrap themselves in the spiritual glamour of the phrase, but all it really means is I showed up. I tried in my way. Our cars are old enough to be in a college. There's always a duct tape look to them. We run our vehicles down just like our bodies. It's rare, but some of us are healthy. Healing? I don't think I've seen it. Our gear is the entire range of mountain climber gifted Arctics pants with the matching jacket to factory outlet mall orange coats. Free box fresh, that donation tent couture. We smoke like chimneys, cigars, cigarettes, weed, mountain smoke, and something strange with chamomile. Home rolls are the norm. You know you're hanging with water protectors because none of us drink any of it. Red Bull, coffee, tea, soda pop, Gatorade, whiskey, and kratom. The food we cook is everything in between organic, vegan, gluten-free chickpeas, dumpster dived packaged meat, or smoked salmon and roadkill salvage. The most carb loaded feed an armly for $1. You can tell I was raised poor by these dinners. Always a baseball bat in the trunk, but no gloves or ball. Yes, we have weekend warriors, those that vacation in the movement, day trippers, and those family that are so everywhere that you can't keep track of which camp or continent or cause they are at, always fighting. Been in camp so long, the idea of home is gone. Some of us don't sleep soundly. The sounds of helicopters wake us, or we sleep too much, missing the adrenaline rush of another riot line and that addictive feeling of purpose that maybe the fate of the world depends on what we do here. We pray every day for the water, for the children. Our resistance is ceremony. Dear God, let my friends live through the night. Let them get out of jail. And finally, dear God, if tomorrow is it, and you and I will be meeting shortly, let me not embarrass myself. Let me do right by the ones that brought me here. Let me be fearless just one more time.
Yeah. That was really great. That was really great.
And this is from a collection. It ain't over until we're smoking cigars on the drill pad. And the drill pad at Standing Rock is where they were cutting underneath the river, the Missouri. And they built a fortress on top of it, made out of what I think they called them HESCO walls. It's a technology they created in Afghanistan of these steel cages full of gravel that you can pile up. And they created a dry moat and then put a chain link fence, like kind of blocking it, and then wrapped it in razor wire. and they had snipers guarding the top of it, and a couple hundred cops and a few hundred National Guard. So the drill pad was like this moment, like, are we gonna, like, everyone was like getting themselves psyched up, like, oh fuck, this is gonna suck. This is gonna be bad. Guys, I got a really bad feeling about this one. And then Obama magicked it all away. So there wasn't this giant violent confrontation. More people survived that way, which is good, of course. And at the same time, by their own internal intelligence reports from the pipeline, they believe the Dakota XL Pipeline would have been stopped if the workers or the police killed a water protector. By their own admission, that was one of their greatest fears. And it was kind of this really weird dichotomy, like, do as much absolute violence to the water protectors so they quit fighting, but don't kill them. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. My book is at marktilsen.com, www.marktilsen, MARKTILSEN. I just got caught up on shipping. I'm very happy and proud about that. Now I just got to worry about my international shipping, which next time I swear I'm going to outsource because this is so much of a pain in the butt.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your being with us.
Yeah.
And the poetry we didn't expect. So thank you so much for sharing that really, really tremendous poetry with us.
Oh, it's an honor.
Well, it was an honor to host you. So thanks so much.
Yeah. Any final questions before we wrap it up?
No, but I was really interested. Oh, Lewis, did you have a question?
Has the Biden administration been any better, any improvement at all?
Yes and no. I mean, they killed the KXL pipeline, but they authorized line 3 and said nothing about line 5. So it's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I think it might come down to who the pipeline companies are and where's the campaign contributions, because it's not based off of a sound ethical principle. It's not based like, oh, we're gonna stop the Permian because we don't like how the future of that energy corridor is going to work out. Or it's not like we're going to make sure all of our refineries are American owned because they just allowed the authorization of the Crown, one of the big ones out of Lake Charles, over to the Saudis. Mm-hmm. So they're making a lot of like very political but inconsistent decisions. So it's like, is it better? It's like, I don't know. Obama authorized all these pipelines to go through, and it's really like it's almost, we actually need something more than to defeat them politically. We have to get to the point where we destroy them culturally. The economic side is way like Ron sounds very naive in the movie, and he's learned a lot, and he's got gray hair now. And all these youngsters are like, we're not quite that young anymore. And one of the things is that like we didn't know we could cost the Dakota XL Pipeline another $4 billion and it would still be a viable project. Mm-hmm. But when they restarted KXL, they used that 4.8 billion overrun cost. They just incorporated it into the overall cost of the projected project for the new KXL. So you're dealing with a near infinite pool of money. And also, most of the money isn't theirs. It's being given to them by the premier of Alberta, or they're whipping it out of nowhere from the banks. And it's like, it doesn't actually have to be hard money, or like, it doesn't have to be money that they've earned with revenue, with income. It comes from the fantastic idea of more money. So we're not fighting a guy who has $4 or $5 billion in his pocket. We're fighting corporations, multiple corporations that have access to the infinite global pool of money.
Just,
so-
I'd like to add here in Texas, we have a huge incentive, a tax incentive program for supposedly new jobs coming in. And a great majority of it is over on the Texas coastal areas where all the gas and pipeline companies are getting these big tax breaks, and they get tax breaks for like 10 years at a time.
Dang.
Yeah.
And also, when we were down in Louisiana, a lot of the folks that were coming in to work on the pipelines that we were working on were based out of Canada. They were Canadian companies like Kinder Morgan.
Mhm.
And this money has no allegiance and it has no nationality.
Mhm.
Like there's indigenous resistance in northern Mexico fighting against pipelines down there. And that's way scarier than anything we had to deal with up here, because those folks just will get disappeared. Yeah.
That's not the most cheerful place to end, but it's true.
Sorry.
It's just true. Thanks once again for
What
your
I will
time.
say is, to lead on a happier note, the moment of absolute resistance, and you can hear it in the voice of those people who are sitting in those tree sits, that it brings joy to your life. It actually does. The more that we resist, the more that we build together, the more that we foster, dare I say, hope, the more joy we can have as we fight. And it's important.
Well, that's a great place to end. Thank you for that. And again, thank you for your time. It's been great hosting you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.